Hello, in this video we're going to look at supply and demand in Chapter 2. So we're talking about competitive labor markets at the beginning of this chapter. And here we have many firms that demand labor services, as well as many people who supply their labor services. The wage is determined by the interactions of all potential buyers and sellers. So there's no single person or individual or single firm that is responsible for setting the market wage or going market wage. Firms and workers take the going wage as a given. We might say that everyone is a wage taker. We're going to assume all workers in a particular market are identical. So for example, in the market for truck drivers, the general assumption that we'll start with is that all truck drivers are equally capable, equally skilled. Firms and workers are also free to enter and exit or leave a competitive labor market. So let's start with the demand side, the market demand for labor. The labor demand curve shows the quantity of labor demanded, or hours of work, at different wages. The market demand for labor simply adds up all the individual labor demand curves for firms. And so here is our downward sloping labor demand curve. At a wage of $1,800 a week, firms in this market collectively would hire 2, or this is in millions, 2 million nurses. If firms had to pay $1,200 a week, collectively all the firms in the market would be willing to hire 3 million nurses per week. Why does the labor demand curve slope downwards? Two effects. There is a substitution effect. An increase in wages makes hiring workers relatively more expensive compared to using other inputs in the production process. So an increase in nursing wages would imply that firms would use fewer nurses and as a result end up using more doctors or nursing assistants, perhaps some type of capital or technology to substitute for nursing services. There's also a scale effect from a wage increase. A wage increase will cause the cost of production to rise, reducing the firm's output and raising product prices. Firms will use less labor when producing less output. So when wages go up, there's a substitution effect. Firms will use other inputs in lieu of labor, and there is a scale effect. A wage increase will cause cost of production to rise. Firms will cut back on output and simply will not need to use as many workers. These effects will hold logically in reverse. A decrease in wages, there's still a substitution effect, and there's still a scale effect. But this time, these effects will lead to firms to want to hire more workers. The height of the labor demand curve. For a given number of workers, the height of the labor demand curve reflects the maximum wage firms are willing to pay. This maximum willingness to pay reflects the marginal value of labor, or what we're going to call the value of the marginal product. And this can be simply thought of as the increase in revenue from hiring an additional worker. So the value of labor, the marginal value of labor, is basically how much the firm's revenue will go up if you hire one more worker. So here the marginal value of labor of the second or the 2 millionth nurse. Okay, we find the second or 2 millionth nurse here. We walk up to the labor demand curve. The height of this tells us that that worker is worth $1,800 to the firm. By hiring that last worker, the firm's revenues would go up by $1,800. And one point here that we'll get into more detail later on in the course, because of diminishing returns to labor, the labor demand curve slopes downwards. The first worker hired will have a bigger effect on production than, say, hiring the 100th worker. Factors that shift the labor demand curve. An increase in the demand for the firm's product causes an increase in the labor demand curve. As college enrollments fall, the demand for faculty decreases. As college enrollments rise, the demand for college faculty increases. An increase in the price of the firm's product makes what labor produces more valuable, so the demand for labor increases. And this would hold logically in reverse. Productivity increases from capital or innovations can increase labor demand by, again, making workers more valuable to the firm. Changes in other input prices. A decrease in the price of capital would lead to a substitution effect. Firms would want to use more labor and less capital in this case. And there would also be a scale effect. When we have a decrease in the price of capital, firms will use more labor because costs of production have fallen. Let's talk about the market supply now. The market labor supply curve shows a relationship between the wage and the number of people willing to work, and this will be simply the sum of all individual labor supply curves. Remember, households supply labor. So here is an upward sloping labor supply curve. If nurses are paid only $600 per week, we'll have 1 million nurses willing to work for $600 per week. When the wage rises here, we see that more nurses are willing to work at a higher wage. The height of the supply curve here gives the marginal cost of workers' time. It is the minimum wage, again, the height of the supply curve, it is the minimum wage a person needs in order to work. This is going to likely represent the foregone alternatives to doing something else, leisure or working in another job. So we can think of the height of the labor supply curve again as a minimum asking price. At minimum, these nurses here, this first nurse or this 1 millionth nurse here needs at least $600 a week in order for her to provide her nursing services. Anything less than that, she'd rather do something else, perhaps not working or working in another occupation. A few things also about this labor supply curve. Again, it's upward sloping. As the wages of faculty, for example, rise, more people will want to work in universities than for either the private sector or local, state, or federal government. So as the wages of faculty members rise, it'll be more attractive to work in a university compared to alternatives. Those people that need a high wage to work in a particular occupation must have very attractive options outside that occupation. Factors that shift the labor supply curve: an increase or decrease in the population, a change in the attractiveness of working in another occupation. So an increase in the wages of truck drivers may decrease the supply of warehouse workers as warehouse workers switch to become truck drivers. Government policy, welfare, taxes, and mandates can affect labor supply. Changes in the desire and attractiveness of leisure activities may change labor supply. If video games are becoming more attractive, then young people may think twice about working. Miscellaneous things, divorce, birth control, technology in the home, the role of women in the workplace. If attitudes are changing on any of those things, labor supply can change or shift as well.